Shall we start with some questions regarding your background, your family, your education, and your youth?
Sure. So, I grew up in North London, eldest of 4 boys, and my parents were secular Jews whose parents or grandparents had come to England either just before or just after the First World War, mostly from what's now Russia or Poland. My mother's side was dominated by a man who, her grandfather was a very well-known Yiddish author between the wars, Sholem Asch. And her mother, who was my grandmother, who I was very close to all her life, was his daughter. So there was a kind of cult of this great writer who did some interesting books and some, I think, books that haven't lasted very well. And on my father's side, quite different. His father was a Bundist, so there was this milieu of the world of Tsarist Jewish Marxist socialism that was not Bolshevik, but was very familiar with the world of the left, was secular. All of this is probably impenetrable to people today, but it had its implications down the road. So that was the background, and we grew up in North London. I went to state schools. I went to Oxford to do classics and philosophy for no very good reason, except that it was a 4-year course and all the others were 3-year courses, and I was in no hurry to get a job. So I learned ancient Greek at Oxford. It was the 2nd year that you could go and do classics as an undergraduate at Oxford and not have done ancient Greek at high school, because they were trying to expand classics to bring more kids from state schools. So I did classics and I learned ancient Greek, and that was why I first went to Greece, was to look at the ancient sites. And so that was my first degree, was in classics. And I didn't do history, interestingly enough. In the Oxford degree, ultimately you choose 2 of ancient history, philosophy, ancient and modern, and ancient literature. And this is for the second part, so-called grades. And for grades I chose ancient literature and philosophy. My philosophy tutors were mostly Wittgensteinians, very passionate Wittgensteinians. And they were big intellectual influence, and the ancient literature people less so, but I had this very remarkable Don called Donald Russell, who was even then an old man and who's still alive and in his 90s. And as a young man, he'd been a code breaker at Bletchley Park. He'd learned Japanese in 6 months to decipher the Japanese signals. And he was an absolutely brilliant, he was, maybe he still is, the leading ancient literary expert on ancient literary criticism, quintillion. And I think I was a great disappointment to him, and the experience of being taught by Donald made me realize I could never be a classicist, because I could never have this, even this interest, let alone the skill, in figuring out what ancient taste was about. So I got to Greece, but I decided I wasn't going to be a classicist. We're now in 1981 when I graduated, and I knew I didn't want to go off and get a job. It was the Thatcher years, and a lot of people from Oxford were going into the city. The city was opening up. And I applied in the summer of 1981 to the British Council for a summer language course. And I applied to go to Cluj in Transylvania, which I'd heard was still very beautiful. I still haven't been there. And they were full up, and my second choice was Thessaloniki. And so I went to Imcha for the language school, and I learned Greek. And then I went down and stayed in Egina with the mother of a student who'd become a friend of mine at Oxford. And that was Kalliopi Borodara, who we're now in 1981, was about to become, or maybe had just become, a PASOK MP. And so that was my introduction to modern Greece, and I liked it very much. And I was going off to do an MA. Tell me if this is too much detail for you.
No. I was wondering, is it a form of escapism?
Yes, I think so. England seemed dull and grey and suburban and into making money, and also quite socially inhibited. You know, all these Oxford clubs and dinner parties, very class-bound, didn't like it really. So absolutely, I think it was a form of escapism, or, you know, to put it more kindly, it was an alternative universe. You could see people behaving a different way. And I went and did a master's in international affairs in Bologna at Johns Hopkins University, who had a School of International Studies there, which was perfect for me. Firstly, they would pay. Secondly, it was an American university, which just meant you could choose all your courses. It was very free in the course choice. And I was exploring, would allow me to explore economics and international affairs and history for the first time. And thirdly, it was in the Mediterranean. So in 1981, I went to Bologna, and I had 2 fantastic years in Bologna, and I liked Bologna and the Bolognese very much, and I learned Italian. And I learned about economics and history and politics and current affairs for the first time. But faced with this American approach to education, where the student chooses a vast array of different courses and very few of them are fixed, I felt a bit at sea after the English system, where it's all laid down. And so I thought to myself, I have to have some common theme that cuts across all of these, and for reasons I don't really know, I chose Greece. So if I was doing a course in history, I would write a paper about Greece, a course in economics, and so on. I ended up writing my master's thesis for this on the Greek tobacco industry, even though I don't smoke. I mean, it was classic academia, and I liked it very much. Most of the people either left after a year, or they spent the second year in Washington. And for a few people, you could opt, if you were lucky, to spend the second year in Bologna. So that meant you weren't interested in business, and you weren't interested in Washington politics, which I wasn't. So I had 2 years in Italy. I had got quite interested in Greece by the end of this time, and I decided that if I could, I would go back to Oxford and do a PhD in history. Or go back to England and do a PhD in history, do something on Greece. And I thought, well, let it be economic history, because I'd had 1 or 2 courses. There were some very, very good historians teaching at Johns Hopkins. Adrian Littleton, maybe at that time the best historian of Italian fascism, still a friend of mine. Vera Zamagni, very serious Italian economic historians, and actually very good economist as well. So it was intellectually a really interesting place. So I decided I'd go back in '83 and do a PhD in modern Greek history, and there were 2 choices of supervisors in England at that time if you wanted to do that. There was Richard Clogg at King's, and there was John Campbell, the anthropologist at Oxford, and I liked them both very much. But I opted for John, who I got on with very well and I liked very much. And so I went back to Oxford, now as a graduate student, which is a very good thing to do if you've been an undergraduate at Oxford, because it destroys all your nostalgia for Oxford. So my friends who I'd been undergraduates with, who remain very nostalgic about Oxford, I look at Oxford with different eyes. But that's what I did. I spent the next 4 years doing a PhD. And as I say, I chose economic history because I was thinking that Thatcher is cutting the universities and there may not be jobs, and this way I can go and get a job in the Bank of England. That was for some reason my God knows why, my backup option.
So excuse me, may I ask, you had a background in classics and philosophy.
Yes.
And then you also, your PhD supervisor was an anthropologist.
Correct.
Yes.
But your option was for economic history.
Correct.
Mm-hmm.
So was it more or less a professional, let's say, perspective that led you to economic history, or there was an underlying intellectual influence as well?
Well, I think I liked history, although I hadn't done very much of it. I mean, I had, at this point, virtually no education in history. I mean, I'd taken a course with Adrian, I'd taken a course with Vera Zamani. I'd taken a course with John Harper on America and the Cold War. That was it. I mean, that's half of what our incoming grad students at Columbia do in their first year. That was some of my education in history. So no, it was a very loose system in those days. You could go to Oxford and John would take supervisions in history as well as anthropology because he'd written some history as well. Yeah. The Ben volume on modern Greece.
Some more things about Cabell.
Yes, absolutely.
An unknown person.
Sure. So John is, I think, absolutely critical figure in the context of your project because he trained so many people across several generations, really from Michael Llewellyn Smith, who was his first student, to Vasilis Gounaris. So right across those generations, and I was nearer the Vasilis end, but somewhere in the middle. John was a social anthropologist. He'd studied with Evans Pritchard. He'd done economics in Cambridge before the war. Like so many people of his generation, it was the war experience that had transformed his intellectual horizons, had taken him to Greece. He'd fallen very ill with TB. He only had one functioning lung. And he'd come back and done a PhD in social anthropology. And that had been, the fieldwork had been among the Sarakatsani. It was the fieldwork that led to Honour, Family and Patronage, this classic of his that he had done after spending time up in the Zagoria with Sheila, his wife. When I knew him, which was to say 1983, John was a settled member of this new Oxford Graduate College, St Antony's, which is a very important place. He had resigned the university lectureship in modern Balkan history because it was too much work. He was well off, thanks to Sheila. They lived in a nice house on Boars Hill. They had 3 beautiful girls, and a lot of John was a very devoted family man. And he was also very humane. So he was not dogmatic, he was not party-pre. He had very good judgment. I would not say he was particularly intellectual. John was not somebody who was going to make you learn the latest historiographical trends. And he was very, very laissez-faire. I mean, he just let you get on with it. But because of who he was and where he was, anybody interested in modern Greece came to him and things came to him. And actually the first time I went to his office in St Antony's, he said, well, these might interest you. And along the wall, along the back of his office, were about 50 files from the Ionian Bank archives. And they did interest. In fact, I used to take them away and work from them, and they became a very important source for my project because they included the branch files from Kavala and Xanthi, and so you got into this provincial economic history. But that was his style. He just let you get on with it. And actually, we spent a lot of time together. But most of the time was really, he was worried about his daughters and their boyfriends, and he regarded us as experts on the new generation who could guide him. So I could tell you completely irrelevant stories, but I won't because they're still alive and they're friends of mine. So that was his style. But it meant he attracted a lot of people because he wasn't stupid. He was very, very smart. And a lot of devotion. And Charles Stewart, there was a group of us. Charles Stewart was doing anthropology. We became friends there. Jelena Harlaftis, who does economic history. Charis Flavianos. So a lot of my oldest friends were formed around John, in effect. And Charles and I, in 2008, put together a Festschrift for him. And then we had a party at their house a few months before he died. He died very suddenly. And it was an extremely happy occasion because everybody had really now that I see academia from the other side, unusually warm feelings towards this man. So that was John. Was he a big influence on me? Well, he was an influence on me in several sort of positive, negative ways. He wasn't a historian. I think that was liberating, although I didn't realize it at the time. He was an anthropologist, which meant that, you got this close to the ground view. He had written this analysis of patron-client relations, which meant I was very close to that analysis, but I didn't have to buy into it. He wasn't that kind of guy. So later on, it made me think a lot about theoretical framings of Greek society, and how well did they actually work, and how was it that John could write this classic of the Sarakatsani in a region that had been devastated in the previous decade, and you never, in that book, ever got a hint of what had happened in those villages in the previous 15 years. Nothing. So did that matter? That was an interesting kind of question. So I think for me it was very, I tended always to know what I wanted to write, and it was nice to have somebody. And actually I should be fair to St. Anthony's and to John. He went on leave one year and he said, you've got to have somebody supervising you while I'm on leave. And the best economic historian at St. Anthony's, which had several very good economic historians, was Patrick O'Brien. So Paddy O'Brien became my second supervisor, and they worked together. And Paddy was completely different and very hands-on and very rigorous and extremely good and smart. So I had the benefit of both of them, really. And there was never any career advice, which would be different from the way we train our graduate students today. There was never any discussion of where this was going to lead. I remember once telling John, a job has come up at Princeton in the program in Hellenic Studies with the history part, should I go for it? And he said, no, absolutely don't go for that. That will just be language teaching. You don't want to do that. So of course I went for it and I got it, and that's how I became a historian. So I knew John well, and I knew what he had to offer, and after that I went to Princeton.
But before, when you were doing your thesis, did you start coming to Greece? Did you have any,
absolutely.
Did you have any contact with Greek historians, the community here, the intellectuals? Would you like to say?
Sure. So the second year that I was studying, I came to Greece for the year, and I lived in Metz, and I went off to work in the Bank of Greece library. And my guide really around the scene was Kostas Kostis, who was, I guess he was finishing his PhD in Paris then. And economic history was flourishing. And at a time when many archives were still not very easily accessible, which has sort of changed quite a lot now, I think. The Bank of Greece was an exception. First of all, it had a really excellent library from exactly the period that I was studying, from the 20s. I decided to write a PhD on the debt default. It was a kind of intellectual problem I'd set myself, which was how could you... Everybody seemed in the 80s still to be interested in fascism. I hadn't studied history, but I could get that much. And they seemed to connect fascism with the Depression. So how was it that in Greece the move to fascism comes actually after the Depression? So that was, as it were, an intellectual question I generated for myself. What was the connection between the bankruptcy of 31 to 32 and the rise of metaxas? It didn't really seem that there was much connection, and probably the reason for political rather than economic. So Bank of Greece was a good place to go, especially after having looked in the Ionian Bank archives. So I spent a lot of time there, and I got to know people. It's difficult for me to reconstruct who I knew in that year, and I was mostly just going to the archive. Or I had a circle of friends who were not historians. But certainly, I mean, if the bigger question is, when did I get to know Greece? That's when I got to know Greece, in that year, 84 to 85. And it was the early PASOK years. And so there was the energy of that.
Did you have this feeling that there was a new era? Just after
Well, I think so. I think so in several ways. Firstly, that number of the people that I knew were involved in PASOK or in the PASOK government. I think I've mentioned Kalliopi Bordaro, who was a kind of larger-than-life figure. And I have a mother of my own, but she was a semi-mother. She was a massive presence, and because I got to know her well, then I could see all the different sides of this personality and what it meant to be a politician. And she fixed me up at another point with a summer job teaching English to I actually can't remember who it was, another politician's children. So off we went in the limousine. So I was aware there was social energy around PASOK, but there were limousines. There was going to the front of the queue when you're waiting for the ferry. It wasn't complete idealization by any means. There was rudeness and pulling rank. All whether you were a man or a woman didn't matter, obviously. But then there were other things. So there was all the energy around Rembetika and around the rediscovery of the 1940s, which I wasn't yet working on, but I was picking up a lot of pamphlets from the carts around the university, and so this great, fantastic energy to rediscover, but many things as well, Moskov and the early work on, I was thinking, of course, the work on Thessaloniki. So the very first beginnings of an interest in the Ottoman, the anti-nationalist move, which became very strong amongst historians, all of that was really getting going then, and it was exhilarating actually. And Italy had been to me a paradigm of a society that was locked in a sense of futility, of immobility. Do you know that film, La Gran Bellezza, that came out? I think it gets that very well last year, right? This sort of sense nothing is really going to change. And, Bologna, which had this thriving communist culture, had sort of ghettoized itself, right? There was a sense that, you were never going to do anything with Rome. Italian socialism was a joke. Bettino Craxi, you couldn't believe it. And Greece felt different in the 80s, okay? So that energy I liked.
Because in Italy the political system collapsed and the social ties as well.
And also that, there was a lot more cynicism about corruption, right? Yes. And there wasn't a lot of cynicism in Greece in the 80s. It was early. Now we know, to quote John Lewis Gaddis, but not then in that way. More very optimistic, and a lot of the optimism was justified too. A lot of changes, and you got this sense of intellectual invigoration, people coming back and teaching here and setting up things. And that only intensified with time, and then the banks got in with the various Morphotica Idrimata, and when I got interested in Thessaloniki, then there was the founding of the early days of the Jewish community, the Jewish Museum.
When did you become interested in Thessaloniki?
So, that was first of all, that was the first place I'd studied Greek in. So I was always interested in Thessaloniki. So that was when I'd done this summer school at IMCHA in 81. But that was not a big... in 84-5, when I was in Greece, by then I knew I enjoyed traveling around northern Greece. So I traveled around northern Greece a lot. Because that Ottoman dimension was there. Because actually I liked the landscape, because there's more water. So I explored a lot. I explored a lot of Greece. I know quite a lot of the mainland quite well. But that dissertation was, the topic was a sort of pure intellectual, almost kind of antiquarian interest. And I say that because when I started teaching at Princeton, when I got the job at Princeton, which was in 1988, and I went in 1989, and Dimitri Gondikas was just building up the program in Hellenic Studies that's become really so important, I found myself in a history department for the first time. So for the first time I was in a history department in any capacity, and for the first time I was teaching. And now I was actually not teaching Greek history, because who wanted to study modern Greek? I was teaching European history with some things on Greece. So for 3 months I was a researcher for Thames and HBO. They had a team of about 8 researchers. It was fantastic, because what they were going to do was, and what they did, was to produce a program that would be a mock tribunal of inquiry into Kurt Waldheim's past. So they weren't going to spend a lot of money on the mise en scène. They were just going to have a studio, but they hired real lawyers who were probably very expensive. But the real expense of the program was to pay for a team of 8 to 10 researchers who would scour the archives, interview people, and find out, better than anyone else had done, what exactly he'd done during the war, and then make this available to both sides for this tribunal of inquiry.
It's actually interesting, because it seems to me that World War II is such a big thing in British historical culture, isn't it?
Yes,
so
yes.
Did it interest you at the time? Did you become interested, or did it...
Well, that was the beginning of my interest in the Katochi.
Yeah.
Before that, no, not really, except from what I could glean from being here. But that was the beginning of it.
You read it in the preface of your book.
Yeah, so, but there was something else there. So the first thing was, that got me interested in the Katochi. And I was one of 2 people, but and the other one was a journalist, I was the only historian, who were asked to go and basically live in Greece for 3 months on a TV company's research budget, which was great. I mean, that was completely different from being an academic. And so you could, you know, if you thought that there was an old Yaya in Yanina who you should interview, you were supposed to go there and interview. I mean, if you do a PhD in Oxford, that's not how it works. So there was that experience of just the resources you could throw into research. But a lot of it was archival, because he was basically a desk officer with Army Group E in Thessaloniki, in the intelligence unit. And so actually most of the work was just reading the documentation. And so I started for the first time, and a lot of this documentation is available in microfilm, looking into the archives of what he had read and what he'd written. And then when certain specific things leapt out at me, because of course we were bloodhounds, we were supposed to be on the trail of war crimes, right? I mean, that was in our minds. So if there was anything suspicious in what I read, I was supposed to investigate it. So the big issue at the time was supposed to be the deportation of the Jews from Thessaloniki and from Yanina, so I investigated that. But then I realized that actually, if you wanted to get Waldheim, to be crude about it, the much more promising avenue was the anti-partisan campaigns of the Wehrmacht, which he really was more involved in. And so there I was starting to read all the documents on the German side, and also go to some places where, and not all of them known. So the place that I went to was Comeno in Arta, which was not, people tended to know about Distomo, they knew about Calavrita, but they didn't know about Comeno. So I actually had a very moving few days in Comeno, and I stayed with somebody who'd survived the massacre as a little boy and talked to a lot of people. So I was right in the history of the Katochi, and I remember that the London Review of Books asked me to write something about this, and so then I thought, I'd finished the PhD, well, this is an interesting subject. Actually, your question was, in a way, does it connect up with a British interest in the Second World War? Not really, because the British interest in the Second World War is in a different realm. It's about the Blitz, maybe it's about resistance, it's about Churchill, it's about growing up with an air raid shelter at the bottom of your garden, which I did. You know, we had all the architecture of the war around us in London. Greece, Germans, no, not really. So, but also, and interestingly, once I resurfaced out of this TV investigation, it became clear to me that all these pamphlets that I was reading here, in Solonos and so on, were not about this either. They were about the Kembriana, I Capitani, I MLS, Inglesi. It was actually about the Cold War, is what it was. It was about the Cold War read back into the Second World War. And so that interested me now, I could see. And so when I went to Princeton, to teach European history, for the first time I started to get a sense of something that then came to appeal to me very much, which was historiography. And I could see how odd this was, that there was this historiographic engagement of the whole society in Greece with the 1940s in which the Germans were absent, completely absent. Nobody talked about the Germans. Why? That was bizarre. And so that was the origin of the second book.
That's very interesting and very complex, actually.
Yeah.
I'm glad you bring it.
Yeah.
Because it seems that it's, there are no parallels between, let's say, the British.
No, absolutely. I think not really. I think not. And in fact, on the contrary, I remember we would still be having all these workshops at King's College, which were still everybody shouting at everybody else about, why had you supported Zervas or why had you not supported Zervas? And I mean, I can remember the personalities, and it was all that argument. That was, the Woodhouse-Myers argument. Should we have backed the communists? Did we back the communists too much? It was all that up in the mountains argument. And insofar as these guys were interested in the rest of Greece and the resistance, it was only had they been militarily effective. That was really the Michael Foot line of inquiry, which had been the wartime line of inquiry in London. Would supporting the resistance be militarily effective? If you said that's not the question is, was resistance the emergence of an alternative form of political mobilization? They weren't interested in that, because that was a problem for Greek society, but that wasn't a problem for the British, right? So they weren't that interested.
So, what's next after Princeton? What happens in your professional career, your research interests?
So
you're moving towards the Katahi?
Yeah, so Princeton was my education as a historian, and at that point I realized that I really liked history and I really liked doing history. I made some good friends. None of them really did Greek history. Peter Mandler, who does British history, Steve Kotkin, who writes about Soviet history, Gyan Prakash, who does South Asian history. So one's horizon suddenly broadened, because the horizons of an American department are very, very, very wide and getting wider all the time. So that was very exhilarating, and you had to make whatever you did interesting to all these people. So that was terrific. At the same time, it was a very intimidating environment, because the American system is very hierarchical. It's great to be an undergraduate at an American university, it's great to be a graduate student, it's great to be a tenured professor, but it's very difficult to be an untenured professor. That's the worst position, in a way, because you have 6 or 8 years of hell trying to impress people, and these people included Lawrence Stern, Natalie Zeman Davis, Arno Mayer, Anthony Grafton, Peter Brown. Karl Schorsky had just retired, he became a friend. Felix Gilbert was around. I mean, it was utterly intimidating. Terrifying, actually. So, without realizing it, I liberated myself, and after 2.5 years, for personal reasons, because my then wife didn't want to live in the States, I went back to England, and this was, again, complete chance, and I got a job at Sussex. And at that time, and I got a job in the International Relations Department at Sussex. Now, if you were to do, as I now know, international relations in the United States, you could not really make the jump from a history department to an IR department, because they have so little to do with each other. But in English universities, then and now, there's a much closer connection. The IR department at Sussex was new. Sussex was a new university. There was a lot of interpenetration of disciplines. The head of the IR department was an extraordinarily charismatic historian called Christopher Thorne, who died very young, a few years after I got to know him. Wonderful guy. He'd written some really, I mean, you'd now say he was a pioneer of international history. Great books about the international diplomacy of the Second World War, how you fit Anglo-American diplomacy in the much larger scheme of East Asian, South Asian relations. Brilliant stuff. He was a brilliant guy. And he was also a Philhellene, so we had lots of things to talk about. He once, a year before he died, he walked across the whole of Crete from east to west. He was a maniac in his way. But, so I went into Chris's department. There were only 5 or 6 people. And it was really a split between people like Chris Thorne, who were essentially, he'd come out of journalism to become a historian, and people who wanted to prove that international relations is its own subject, it has its own theory, it's very, very serious, blah, 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 blah. And I was much more in the Chris Thorne camp. So that had 2 consequences intellectually. One was I was asked to teach, I was there as a historian, but the history that I was asked to teach didn't stop in 1945, as it had in Princeton, or would in most history departments. I was supposed to teach history up to the present.
European history.
World history. World's 20th century. Well, I was in an international relations department. World history. Anything I thought was important. World history, obviously, because it includes colonization, things like that. So that was the first thing, and that was very good. And the second thing was I had to teach things. There was a subject called foreign policy analysis. It was supposed to give you the theoretical foundations for analyzing foreign policy.
So this was the basis for your next book about Europe?
In a way it was, but the point about the foreign policy analysis course was it was complete crap. I mean, I just thought this is not a subject. Well, my view would be that there is no science that is waiting to be discovered that is in any sense going to give you predictive analytic tools for interpreting foreign policy. All of that's intellectual bullshit, right? It's you can analyze, you can interpret, you can comment, but don't pretend it's a science. So I had this very unpleasant experience of teaching a subject that I thought was rubbish, or which meant I was teaching against it the whole time. So that got me interested in the impulse to theorize in the social sciences. And after 4 years, I was able to move from the IR department into the history department, and so I was relieved of that. But the 2 things remain. First of all, the interest in how the post-45 links up to the pre-45, and secondly, the interest in the history of the social sciences, which I'd had ever since Bologna, learning economics. Now, the next book came along because once...
That was an interesting and positive side effect.
It was a very positive side effect for me. I'm still interested by that. Shortly after I arrived at Sussex, no, actually, as I arrived at Sussex, the war in Yugoslavia broke out. And when it spread to Bosnia in the spring of 1992, like many, many people, I was pretty appalled by British policy, and I thought that it should have not imposed the least should not have imposed an arms embargo on the Bosnian government. And so I got very involved, probably more involved than I've ever been in any political issue before or since, in writing about what was happening there for the British public and getting very involved and trying to explain to people what was happening. And of course, at the same time, I was teaching European history. And 1992 was also a time of tremendous kind of complacency and euphoria inside the European community about Europe. So there was this discrepancy. And so at that point, I got this idea of writing a book about the 20th century. Yeah. And so there was the 20th century, and then, I mean, in between there were the Balkans, which came out of the same impulse, explain to people what is really going on in this.
But at the time you kept working in Greece as well, yeah? Because I'm asking this.
Mm-hmm. Well, I realized that I would probably, yes and no. There developed a pattern of a sort of twin track pattern. So I knew that I would never lose my interest in Greece for all sorts of reasons. But there were also other things that I wanted to write about that were larger. And it was somehow the view of the Balkans from Greece, or the view of Europe from Greece, which grew out of my teaching and my intellectual work and the discussions that I had. So I suppose I opted not just to write about Greece. I could have done. after I finished Hitler's Greece. And the Balkans book was written quite quickly, mostly in Princeton Library, which was fantastic. And the Dark Continent book was also written over the space of about a year. And over that 2 or 3 year stretch, I suppose I wasn't doing a lot in modern Greek history.
In the beginning of the 90s, roughly, your work was kind of, it is a point of reference because it seems to me, retrospectively, that it internationalized contemporary Greece. That you didn't, historiographically, you did not treat Greece as a peripheral case,
right,
or
as an anthropological, if you want, perspective or whatever. Or just, you put it within the heart of European work history.
Right.
I think this is a very important aspect of your work. There was, and that's why I'm asking it. And I wonder if you would like to say a few more things about this aspect of your work.
Right. Well, I think that just happened by itself, in a way. When I wrote the Balkans, Greece was the country in the Balkans that I knew best. I traveled around Yugoslavia. I've never been to Albania. I've never been to Bulgaria. I've never been to Romania. So inevitably, it was a partial view. And I suppose even if I had been, I couldn't know all those countries as well as each other. So there would always be a view. But even more so in the Europe Dark Continent, I think that, well, for instance, when the war in Yugoslavia broke out, suddenly it had a huge impact on social scientists because the whole issue of ethnicity re-emerged and ethnic relations, and the whole problem of analysing modern society in terms of class took a back seat. Well, I think, as it happened, if you were interested in Greece, in the kind of way that I was interested in Greece, you'd already made that move anyway, because I remember we'd already at Princeton had a conference on whether to what extent could you usefully apply class analysis to Greek society. So this is where the history of social science comes in. Weren't these social scientific theories that had been generated in very different social contexts? Weberian sociology, it emerges out of a certain social context. So why think that the terms are universals? We were already there before the war in Yugoslavia emerged. And then when it broke out, and suddenly everybody is interested in the problem of ethnic cleansing, well, if you're interested in to Mesopotamia, you start with catastrophe, and that's right. So in that sense, it's natural. You see what I mean? And so Dark Continent probably did involve a playing out of issues that were familiar to me from Greece on the European stage, and per contra, a downplaying of things that were not familiar to me. For instance, I would now say, in that book, there's very little on the history of science or technology. Well, partly because, not that Greece doesn't have a history of science or technology, but if you're a late industrializer and a very limited industrializer, and so on and so on and so on, that is not going to be at the forefront of your concerns. Now there's a really flourishing history of science and so on, but at that time there wasn't. So for good and for bad, I think the vision of Europe was the vision from Greece, and that just seemed natural. And yes, I was reacting against this view that, certain states are hegemonic in every kind of way. Absolutely. Very much so. And probably I was already interested in Thessaloniki and longer run transitions from empires to nation states, and there again, and still to my students, Southeastern Europe and the Middle East looks like the center of things, and Britain looks like the exception. But that was not how it had been taught, say, when I was at Princeton in the late 80s. Not, everybody still thinks Britain, France, and Germany are the central cases. And even now it's changing quite fast.
Was it an asset or a drawback that you were specializing on Greece while you were having a career as a Europeanist or a world historian?
I thought it was worked out just fine for me. The downside would have been if I hadn't found a job. Which was pretty likely. And if I'd listened to John Campbell, I wouldn't have found a job. Bless him. But so that was, once you were in the system, then I think to be at a slight angle to things, and I'll tell you why, because in a way, and I think that I did choose Greece for that reason too. I thought, well, I have the illusion of complete freedom over the questions I pose to myself. If I'm going to get into German history or French history or even Italian history, no, you're in a marked out domain in which everybody's already put up the signposts, and I'd had enough of that doing classics with Donald Russell, I think, right? I just wanted to be able to say, here's this, unspoiled country, right? And here's a really big question, and actually nobody's looked at it, whatever it might be. So there was that freedom that came, definitely.
That might be liberating.
Very liberating.
That there are no constraints.
Very liberating, especially if you're ignorant, you see. If I'd known more, I would have realized, of course, there were constraints, right? But that was also the benefit of not having had a training as a historian.
Would you consider yourself an outsider in both communities? Let's say, the historians community in Greece and the historians community outside Greece?
Well, at the start, I mean, if my dear friend Peter Mandler has known since the age of 10 he wanted to be a historian. He did history as an undergraduate. He went to the best place to do it as a graduate student. I mean, he was so expert in the landscape before he even began his PhD. And I was just in this very, very different situation. So I sort of wandered into this thing, really. Yeah, absolutely. But the difference is that, now that I'm teaching people at Columbia, we teach our students, especially our graduate students, to be intensely self-aware about the historiographical landscape. And actually, I think maybe too much so, because I was the opposite, and I had this supervisor who couldn't have cared less. And it turned out to be liberating for me. I mean, that might have just been luck. So I think there's some middle ground somewhere, but I think we do too much of the figuring out the landscape, really, you see. I do too. I mean, I'm as guilty as anybody.
People should be a bit more.
Yes, I think so. Yeah.
I was wondering if you would like to say a few things about history in Hellenic programs, especially in the Anglo-Saxon world. Today, it seems that, I mean, there is a domineering presence of, let's say, language studies, literature. Is there a place for history? How would you place yourself in this context?
Well, I think one place to start is with the Hellenic Studies programs themselves. There are not very many of them. They are institutionally always fragile and precarious, for the simple reason that almost everywhere, for good reasons, they don't constitute departments. And departments are the building blocks of these universities. So they become brokers between departments. Most of them are not very well funded. And so there were essentially 2.5 in England, King's, Birmingham, the half being Cambridge, nothing really at Oxford. And they're very, very precarious, and they depend very much on 2 or 3 people. So it's very difficult to generalize. In the United States, there are more, and some of them now have quite a significant participation of historians in, and I think that's good. But I think that insofar as we need to be thinking about the training of historians of modern Greece outside Greece, which is a question in itself, because 30 or 40 years ago, the center of gravity was outside the country. But arguably, you could say that now the center of gravity is inside the country, and the real issue should be how do you improve the resources, and how do you improve the intellectual orientation of historians in Greece, right, by perhaps having departments that employ more historians that are not doing Greece at all, right, so that, you get somebody who I've come to know, Kostis Karpozilos, who can come out of Crete with a degree in the American labor movement, right? That's the future, I think. So that I'm less bothered about the future of Hellenic studies programs, and I think you will always get 2 or 3 or 4 students a year who are very, very good, and they may or may not come through the Hellenic studies programs. They might well come through history departments, or they might come out of EUI, or they might come out of Greek universities and do extremely well and then go into a PhD program in a history department. And that's probably where the future of, the contribution of non-Greek universities to modern Greek history lies, I think. So I wouldn't myself worry too much about what happens to modern Greek studies programs, which anyway get bound up in all kinds of debates within American academia about the fate of such programs, and I mean, historians basically need to be trained by historians in history departments, and if they're serious, they'll learn the language. If they're lucky, there'll be classes there, and if they're serious, then they'll go and take them in Greece if they aren't there. I see students coming through American universities, despite the competitiveness of these fellowship programs, who are really, really good.
Do you believe that there is a new generation of Greek historians?
Seems to me to be so, absolutely. Well, we were talking about the Junta Conference, and that was organized by members of this generation. I remember the Samothraki conference some years ago on collaboration, and that was organized by a young generation. So I think that there's no problem of quality of people at all, and humanities are cheap. I mean, if we were talking about genetic research, we would have serious issues, right? But humanities are cheap. So that the task has to be how to support this, and probably really support it more inside the country, because, I mean, actually Greek students have a fantastic record of getting fellowships at places like the EUI or in American universities. So in that sense, I'm moderately optimistic about the future. I think for me the questions lie somewhere else. They lie in the future of magazines and journals, and then above all in whether the culture can change sufficiently so that really sophisticated, interesting discussions take place amongst scholars. But then there's the world of the public. And those channels are much weaker than they are. I mean, the paradigmatic case would be England, where you have a tradition of people who can write for the general public, and they draw on what the professional historians are doing. And America isn't so good, but it's not bad. And in Greece, there's this really gap, and that's partly because of the way people are being trained to write history. I think, which was very, very theorized, and in a way that would put off. I mean, it's not easy to do. It's not easy to write history in a way that is accessible without being dumbed down. But that to me would be the challenge, I think. But then actually, I think the crisis has had a positive effect in that it is pushing people to feel that they should say what they have to say more broadly, that it has a social importance, and that's good.
Now that you're raising this issue regarding public perceptions of history in Greece, would you like to say a few more things about your work on Salonika?
Yeah, sure.
Because there are also a lot of reactions.
It seems that it is a book that initiated a debate.
Okay.
It's an important book. I don't know if you consider it,
Yes.
as an important work yourself, but you've done a whole series of important works. But it seems that for modern Greek history, it has a very special, let's say, place. So, what's your reaction towards this debate?
So So first of all,
did you expect it?
Yes.
probably in a way, without. I mean, it was a book that took a long time, and the time that it took was mostly the time of accumulating materials. It wasn't that it took a long time to write, but it took a long time to accumulate the materials. I suppose in a sense it went back to Imre, but really the spur had come, as I guess it often does, as you know, with a particular find or a particular archive. And it was when I was working on Waldheim, and the World Jewish Congress had just publicized their view that Waldheim was involved in the deportation of the Jews of Salonika. And so my employers in the TV company said, will you find out what you can? And so I rang up to Kendriko Israelitiko Symvolium, and I said, this is who I am, and do you have any materials? And they're an administrative body, they don't have archives. And they said, well, we don't really have archives, but actually the Υπουργείο Δικοσύνης has just delivered 2 βρώμικες σακούλες here. So why don't you come? But you won't want to open them because they're very dirty. And so I went to KISS, and and of course, what do you think? And they were really dirty. I do not think they had been opened since 1949 at the latest. But they were basically all the papers that had survived, or the Υπηρεσίες Διαχειρίσεως Ισραηλιτικών Περιουσιών, which was really interesting, because for all this vast historiography on the Holocaust, at any rate at that time, our knowledge at the local level, the historians had followed the trains. But what happened in the communities and towns and cities after Jewish communities were deported was not something that people had written about. And here you had the whole thing, right? It was about the property. So I remember seeing that, and I made some copies then. And a few years later I came back and made more. They'd been given to the Jewish Museum. And that was I thought, that's another side of Thessaloniki. That's the handover. But I also knew that, to be honest, I didn't just want to write another Holocaust book for all kinds of reasons. I'm afraid there are too many of them, and so on and so on. But I was interested in Thessaloniki. So I wrote this book really for my own pleasure, because the city interested me, even though I didn't have many of the necessary languages, and I was going to tread on a lot of scholarly toes, never mind the toes of the public, right? I mean, you should really have Ottoman Turkish, but the Ottomanists were not being very good at that time in writing about provincial cities, and so on and so on. So you're either a perfectionist or you're not a perfectionist. I'm not a perfectionist. If you're a perfectionist, you couldn't write a book like that, because you'd have to learn all the languages first and so on. So I wrote this for my own interest, and I knew enough about Thessaloniki to know that there was going to be people who liked it and people who didn't like it. But I think that what I didn't anticipate was the extent to which, when it was published, in Greek in particular, because the reviews in England and America were a different story. Everybody likes this kind of story there. When it was published in Greece, there was real shift going on. In the end of the Cold War, people understanding of what the future of Thessaloniki might be. And so the book was tossed into this battlefield. And I hadn't expected that, but it was really fascinating, actually, and I had nothing but good experiences. And if you don't like people standing up in the back of the room and shouting, then you shouldn't do modern Greek history, right? You should do something else. So this was okay. Because never mind Thessaloniki, το εμφύλιο από χρόνια, you always had some guy at the back of the room, right? So this was not different in that sense. It was just some other guy at the back of the room standing up and shouting. And so that I didn't mind that. And it was nice that people would feel passionately about the book. So it was a very positive experience, really.
Shall we say a few things about your latest work?
Mm-hmm.
About this idea of governing the world.
Yeah. So in 2004, I moved to the US for a second time to teach at Columbia. And this was the first year of the American occupation of Iraq. The Bush administration was still in a fairly hawkish frame of mind. I was in New York, which is the home of the UN, and so there was a good deal of discussion about America's place in the world and its relationship to these international institutions. At the same time as all of that was happening around me, there were some quite exciting changes in the profession of history, and international history was emerging as a field, or really better as an umbrella term under which some new things were happening. And transnational history, which is to say the history of movements across borders, was part of that. And another part of that was looking again at the role that international institutions had played in history, in recent history, because they tended to be either neglected or just the subject of extremely boring institutional histories of their own. So in these years, for instance, began a kind of new interest in the League of Nations, which has continued and which has produced really, I would say, important revisions of our understanding of the 1920s, the 1930s, new understanding of the interwar origins of international technocracy in health, in finance, the interwar origins of the IMF, and so on. So I was in the middle of these two things, a big political debate and a professional debate. And the first thing I did was I wrote a book for the publishers. It was their idea, since pretty much anything with Hitler in the title was still selling at that time, to do something that oddly didn't exist, which was to write a history of Europe under the Nazis. And that grew naturally out of the work that I'd done on Greece. It was extremely interesting intellectually. It was work of synthesis. It was extremely hard work because actually there turned out to be far more written about all these different national experiences than I'd ever imagined. But very, 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 very little that looked at the thing as a whole. So you had to do the work of putting the thing together. And it struck me that the Nazis had a vision of the world. And therefore, and we could argue about what it was and whether it changed, but therefore the 1940s could be seen as a contest between competing ideological visions of the world and world order, how the world should be organized. And so the UN emerges in that context, in a context of ideological competition. And I had already been interested in how we had got from the League of Nations to the United Nations because of what had happened in Yugoslavia, where when the war broke out in Yugoslavia in the 1990s, we no longer had the language of minority rights to allow us to understand ethnic cleansing. We only had the language of human rights, which was inadequate. And I was curious about what we had lost in moving from the League to the UN. So the book that I knew that I wanted to write wasn't how the Nazis ruled Europe. It was this kind of book that would mix a history of people's changing ideas about human rights, international organizations, free markets, and so on, with the essentially political history of which kind of world order had come into being. And so I started on this, and I probed into it by looking at a number of particular figures. Jan Smuts, the South African Prime Minister, was one, because I was curious how a South African racist could come to be so important in the origins of both the League of Nations and the United Nations. That wasn't consistent with the history that I had for myself. But I was also very interested in the 19th century histories of ideas that had emerged in the 1820s, the 1830s, and the 1840s about internationalism, when the word first emerged. And so that was how the book got going.
If we are going to close it up, is there any work of yours that you consider your favorite one, that you're particularly proud of, that you would like to carry on? And what about your future?
There are some books that I mean, in general, I don't read my books again, but there are some that I'm fond of, I suppose. So that would be very true of Inside Hitler's Greece, and it would be true of the Salonika book, and then the Hitler's Empire book. I just don't know how the hell I wrote it. But that's a different kind of feeling.
Why?
Well, because there is such an immense. There's a huge historiographic iceberg under the water that took a lot of energy to read all that. But in general, I think that when I write, there's usually an intellectual issue that motivates me that should be new, even though it grows out of something old, and there's often a kind of literary challenge. So that writing in a different genre interests me. So so there are a couple of things that I'm playing around with at the moment, and that I want to do. I've had 3 or 4 years of fairly heavy administrative work when I couldn't write. One is, and they're both sort of new, really, for me. One is I got interested in the history of history through thinking about Eric Hobsbawm, who I knew, and the time, his relationships with French historians in particular. Because the profession of history has changed dramatically everywhere over the last half a century. And while I don't think that was all thanks to Eric Hobsbawm, I think that through this story of his relationship with Braudel and people around Braudel, you have a good way into these changes and what changed. So that's one set of things that I've been doing. And then because of the Governing World book, which starts in the 1820s, the word international is basically coined in the 1820s. I got interested in the 1820s. And, well, you might say as a historian of Greece, you'd obviously be interested in the 1820s, but actually it took a long time for the penny to drop. And the 1820s, I think, are a really interesting and important decade from many, many points of view. Intellectually, they are the birth of our modern political vocabulary and concepts. And they are, of course, the decade of the Greek War of Independence, but they're also the decade of the Spanish Wars of Independence and the decade of the Monroe Doctrine. And all of these things, I think, and the decade of the emergence of the City of London as the centre of global finance capital. All of these things are interconnected in some mysterious kind of way. So the next thing I'd really like to do would be to explore those interconnections. So that's, I hope, what lies ahead.